working on the ships, I was fascinated with the particular experience of the ship Montana, and 3 years ago, almost to the day, I gave a program, Fire and Ice, the last voyage of the ship Montana, and it was the work that I put into that provided my knowledge, the basic knowledge I needed in order to work on these other problems. And you'll see how directly what I learned through the work on the Montana, how that contributed to being able to do things. And most particularly what happened in the aftermath of my program on the Montana, the great-grandson of the captain, Captain Atwood, contacted me. He was fascinated. He knew about his great-grandfather being on the Montana, but he knew very little more than that. And so he contacted me via email, and then he and his wife came from Minnesota to learn more, to come to the Custom House. And it was just wonderful, and he met other family members here. So other members of the Atwood family came in from Maine and New Hampshire, and I started at that point as a vehicle of giving them some kind of a gift, or some of the material I had picked up, particularly about the Captain Atwood. I started to put books together for people or families, and it seemed to really, please them. Let me just, let's see if I do this right. This is higher math. So here is the Montana on the right, one of the paintings within the collection of the Custom House Maritime Museum, and this is Captain Atwood that I've superimposed in there. And that kind of gave me an idea that there are other times where I think that kind of a memento for families, if they have a particular interest in Newburyport, that it would be nice to put together. And I started to think about, well, what kind of materials can I draw on? And lo and behold, then a few months after the descendants of Captain Atwood had been here, Kevin McDonald was giving a tour for members of the Bailey family. Some had come as far as California, right? And it was a pretty good sized group, and I did the same type of thing. And I was using some of the materials here. I don't know if you've ever seen the history of the Marine Society of Newburyport. It has all the captains and all the members of the organization, and it just looks like a kind of a dusty, old kind of book, but it's wonderful, and it's totally free online. It's all digitized and available, and there are a lot of resources that I've discovered how available they are to people. And anyway, I use that to be able to document the 7 captains Bailey. And if you go up to the 2nd floor now in the Mosley Gallery, you see the big group, I don't know, whatever you call that, the group of the portraits of all of the members of the Marine Society. And there are 7 of these Baileys all there, and I use other resources. If any of you are familiar with the website or the web page that the Archival Center at the library has, there are all sorts of resources that you can access online, and you can access this. If it's blowing away, the 1851 map of Newburyport, and Kevin was going to be bringing the Baileys out to where their wharf had been, where the warehouse was, and their office, which is now the Art Association, Newburyport Art Association building, and he was taking them down there. And so, in the book I had that image. And another thing that he had introduced me to was the Cheney Collection, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But this photograph of the Bailey Wharf when it was at its high point, with the molasses coming in from the West Indies and being, delivered to the various distilleries in town. It's a wonderful photograph. but that's all from the Cheney Collection, and that was the widening picture of what was available on Newburyport, and the kinds of media things that could be put together. And it really pleased families when they had something like that. Maybe some genealogical information and where the house is located in another map, that kind of thing. So this is, I swear, these two things are the best part of at least what I've been using so far in the library. The maritime history, and I'm assuming a lot of you have seen it or in libraries or the like. The first time I ever used Cheney's maritime history of the Merrimack, I pretty much want to just throw it down and forget about it, because the index is a nightmare, and there were elements of it that, there was spellings of ships, or the information was a little wacky at times. And then I really started working with it, and it's a gem. It's the most wonderful book, and especially if you're trying to understand ship construction. The last part of it just gives such interesting detail, and who were the riggers and what were they doing, and then he'd have specific records intertwined of the people and who was doing what, the real people, because he was somebody who was part of the fabric, particularly of Rings Island, right across the way. So the work is really wonderful, and a man who, he must have been a fascinating person to talk with. He was the projectionist at the old Howard Theater in Boston. He had a very interesting life, I would say, but he was always centered around his home back on Rings Island, and the book is almost inaccessible in terms. It's so expensive if you ever find it online. It's over $100 or more. And then the other day I saw a copy that a library on the Cape was getting rid of for $35, and I ordered it. I got it, and it's in gorgeous condition. But anyway, the other part of this is this thing called the Cheney Collection. Now, there was a pamphlet put out by, or a booklet that was put out by the Custom House back in 1992 with some examples of what's in the collection. The collection was all the raw material that Cheney was going to intertwine into a series of books about the maritime history of the Newburyport. Then I understood why this first volume was called, underneath, Shipbuilding. That was the first topic he was dealing with, and he intended to produce a multi-volume series. And time got him, and he died before he could really do anything. This was published, the book, his own book on shipbuilding, was published in '64, and he died of a heart attack, and he died instantly in 1967. So he never got to use those raw materials. The raw materials then ended up, and these are volumes of raw materials, photographs, and all sorts of things on every aspect, clippings. Half the time they're unattributed, so you don't have the original source that he got them from, but it's a wellspring of information. And the Yankee magazine initially had it after his death, and then Yankee magazine gifted it to the Custom House in the late '80s, and around that point, because then the pamphlet, the booklet was produced about it. But these are the two sources I'm always, not the pamphlet, but the actual collection itself. It's a wonderful source for the city. And for the Maritime Museum. Let's see if I can keep doing this. One of the first times I saw the value of the Cheney Collection was when a local ship model builder wanted to build a model of a boat that had not been built in Newburyport, but was used between Haverhill and Newburyport, and it's called the Startled Fawn. And it was relatively small for a steamboat operating on the Merrimack, but it had originally been built for the Chicago World's Fair in 1876, and it was something that, sure enough, there were no real pictures locally of this steamboat in operation, and so the model shipbuilder needed, some detail of what it looked like, and it really catches people's eyes, and he was interested too because of all the decorative detail on the bow of the steamboat. And so I pawed through the volume on steamboats that Cheney had compiled, and sure enough, he had photographs, the starboard and port sides of the steamboat, of an actual half-hull model, 2 views of that, and the engines of the steamboat. So good old Cheney, he had any kind of detail, he was amazing. And that really showed me the value of what he had done. Another time that I turned to the book, his book on shipbuilding in Newburyport, was when an inquiry came in. And I forget who was on the phone. Somebody brought the phone to me. I happened to be in the research library, and they said, oh, there's somebody calling from the West Coast, and they want some information. And so I picked up the phone, and he started talking to me like I'd know what he was talking about, because he was, I came to this as an industrial historian, not as anybody with real experience in maritime history. And I guess this is the goddess of maritime debate in the United States. John Glover's schooner Hannah. Does it mean something to other people? Do you sit there and go, oh, the Hannah? Well, this man lived for the Hannah. And I didn't quite get it, and now I have started to get it. It's a learning curve for me to be introduced, and I'm acquiring more knowledge now. And the Hannah has been claimed for many, many years as the first vessel of the U.S. Navy, and therefore gives Marblehead the claim to being the birthplace of the U.S. Navy. Well, if you're from Beverly, you say no. And that's the thing. The fight in this country is over where is the birthplace of the U.S. Navy. So Philadelphia claims it, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Whitehall, New York. Pardon? Well, I don't know. So anyway, he's on the trail of the Hannah. And then he started, this is 2019, I think, I was on the phone with him, and he had suddenly rediscovered an article that had been written back in 1970 by 2 real maritime scholars. And they had the proof. Well, they were arguing. They knew enough not to get in the middle of this fray. They just lay out where all the complaints are and all the claims go. And he had discovered, this model shipbuilder on the West Coast had discovered in the article in 1970 in American Neptune, there was a little gem. They had found documentation down in Barbados of the entry of John Glover's Hannah the year before we started our tiff with Great Britain. Well, it wasn't Great Britain, but anyway, with England, our tiff with England, and that in her entry, meaning coming into the port in Barbados, there were detailed records of the Hannah, and that she was registered in Salem at the time, and that she had been built in Salisbury, Mass. And it was like, whoa, and he wanted to know if we had in Cheney, and he knew about the book, and about the Cheney book, and could I tell him over the phone all the boats that were not named it was a 10-year-old boat, presumably, or schooner, that had been constructed in Salisbury, and I had to read off to him. And then I finally said, no, there's too much. It's, you know, too much to read over the phone and have you take notes on it. So I said, I'll just, you know, type it in on the computer and send it off to you. And then he's come to the conclusion that the real Hannah, because nobody knows what it really looked like, and the conclusions of model builders are that none of the models, this is the model in the U.S. Navy Museum in Washington, D.C., that none of them are correct. And so that's not my argument. But anyway, so these are the boats he worked with, and he's come to the conclusion that it's Samuel Griffith's 45-ton sloop. And he said, well, it doesn't really make a difference, a sloop or a schooner. I can't argue about that, because he said they re-rigged, you know, so many. And the size was right, and he's concluded because in Barbados they said that the schooner that had entered in Barbados was 45 tons. So that was the answer to Hannah. And I never, until I really sat down and read all of the articles, understood how important this was to a number of people. Well, then, not long after, well, once COVID started, I should say, once COVID started, then the foreign inquiries started coming, because of course people couldn't travel. And the first of these foreign inquiries was from a woman in Germany who's publishing a book on James Aiken. And James Aiken was a political cartoonist. He lived in Newburyport and worked here for about 4 years, starting in 1804. Blunt was the person much more known to everybody because he published the American Coast Pilot, the New Practical Navigator, you know, so all the real basics that were coming out of the young country, the young United States in the early 1800s, were coming through the publishing house that Blunt ran. He started in Boston, then he moved to Newburyport. And along comes James Aiken in 1804, for whatever reasons, though some people argue that he had been brought here by Jacob Perkins, who was putting his own plates together, his own steel plates for the printing of banknotes, and that it's at Perkins' encouragement that Aiken came to Newburyport, and it was the up-and-coming place to be, you know, it's, at that time. And Edmund Blunt apparently hired Aiken to do some work for him, and apparently it wasn't satisfactory, and there lay the problem. And the problem led to a rather ugly confrontation in a hardware store in Market Square. And the Blunt and Aiken bumped into one another at this hardware store in Market Square, and Blunt started to yell, and Aiken most probably did his own thing as well. And finally it broke into violence, and Blunt grabbed an iron pot and threw it at Aiken. Aiken ducked. It went out the window of the hardware store, and it hit the glass. As it shredded, it hit passers-by. And among the passers-by was a very young Captain Nicholas Brown, and who was the son of Captain Nicholas Brown. And he was the younger one who got hit with the glass. Was most probably 20, 21 at the time that all that happened. And Aiken decided to get his revenge against, and of course people who had been around there to see what had gone on, they encouraged Aiken to engrave a cartoon showing Blunt throwing the pot at him, and titled it "Infuriated Despondency." Aiken then asked, and Aiken was printing these up, having these printed up, and he was they were printed up on broadsides. He printed this cartoon on children's copybooks that were being sold locally, and it was going all around town. Blunt ended up suing him over this. But Aiken was going to get his revenge again, and Aiken worked out a deal with young Captain Nicholas Brown that he was on his way back to England on a trip, and he was going to bring plates over to the pottery in Liverpool where they did the transfer, pictures and things like that, and it got printed onto this pottery that then was imported into Newburyport and sold, and the story goes that Blunt's supporters were trying to buy them all up and then destroyed them. But it just never ended. Lawsuits, it just went on, and then eventually Aiken left. But the weird part is, of course, I had to learn all of this. And that's, again, the little red ball that's bouncing in front of me, and that I'm not following the real course. What it really boiled down to for the author was she wanted to know, where did he live? But I had learned all of this other stuff, because sometimes you have to understand a larger picture to get the information you want to get to. And so I started looking in the newspapers, and I hope all of you, if you're ever looking for material and trying to find answers to questions in Newburyport, work with the Archival Center's webpage, and you can search Newburyport newspapers going back to the time of the Revolution up until, from home, you can do it up until 1963. So it's a wonderful resource, and so I started to use ads, trying to see if I could find out, search for James Aiken and see if I could find ads for him. And all I was getting, think about it, how much good is this? That he boards directly over Messrs. Thomas and Whipple's bookstore, Market Square, Newburyport. That doesn't give you much detail, right? That's kind of the problem. And so I kept chasing the ads, and then Thomas and Whipple would have other ads because they were selling the engraving that Aiken had done of Timothy Dexter. So the famous thing that ultimately made its way onto the covers of, what is it, whatever it is, the pickle? Yeah, Pickle for the Knowing Ones. Yeah, Pickle for the Knowing Ones. And the ad, of course, just had the little dog, which I think is so funny. But it's, that was a detail. And they were selling the broadsides that Aiken had done and all that. Again, I'm trying to find out, where did he live? So he lives over Thomas and Whipple. Now here, you can see it circled at the sign of Johnson's head. I assume the sign was Samuel Johnson's, painting of Samuel Johnson's head. And that's where Whipple's is located. Well, excuse me, I'm getting dry. Thomas and Whipple were located, and presumably he's up above them. But again, where is Johnson's head? There's no way of finding that. And that was where I got stuck, and I had to tell her eventually that I just couldn't go any further. This was all I could get. And then, a week ago, exactly, I go on to that engine again, and I start searching, and I entered his name, and what do I find? I find Thomas and Whipple. I started searching Thomas and Whipple, and found out that they had an ad in 1806 to let an immediate possession given, a large and commodious back store suitable for West India goods, with a yard adjoining, situated in Mechanics Row, adjoining the bookstore of the subscriber, Thomas and Whipple. And now I had an exact place because it backed up. Thomas and Whipple had this space for rent and with a yard onto Mechanics Row. Now I had to find out where Mechanics Row was, and I went into Courier, and of course there's only one mention of Mechanics Row, and it's the fire of 1811. That's where the fire started. So I was able to use then the booklet that was produced on the fire, and it's not only the map showing where the fire was. Let's see if I can use, oh, look at this, there's Mechanics Row. Okay, oh, science. Mechanics Row, and it hit there. Thomas and Whipple were right at 2 State Street. That's useless. Meaning because I'm shaking. They would have been right here, and so this is right where that to-let apartment was, and so Aiken must have been living above 2 State Street. So immediately when State Street starts, and on that, the even side of the street. So I immediately sent her an email, and then this morning I got an email back from her. She couldn't believe it, that we had solved it. And then looked at down below the ad, the store to let. Edward Rand has received the last ships from Liverpool and Bristol, a large assortment of English and hardware goods. So I looked up Rand. That's his hardware store was right next to Whipple's, Thomas and Whipple's, and there's a good likelihood that it may have been the hardware store with where the confrontation occurred. And I looked in the booklet on the fire, and it was one of the places that was destroyed. And it's just listed as Market Square hardware store, and it's the only place described as a hardware store. Everything else has, other types of food goods and things like that, and might have some hardware, but that was the only place that was indeed a hardware store. So I couldn't think of, it's a twofer, right? All in that one thing. All right, now by far the most complex thing I've been working on has been the identity of the ship Longwood. The Longwood was a ship built in Newburyport in 1863 at the worst of the Civil War. And so the sale of merchant ships was not very lucrative at that point. The construction was not a lucrative thing because Confederate raiders were sinking them. The Alabama was out there. Other raiders were sinking or taking over American merchant ships. So the market for selling a ship that you were building in 1863 was not that good. And the Longwood, as Currier was building it, intended it for sale, as had he had done. Well, my English isn't so good, but anyway, the Valparaiso was built early in 63. Later in 63, he completed the Longwood, and both of them were sold overseas. And you see that in the bottom. Okay, so ship Longwood recently sold at Liverpool. This is 1864, January of 1864, and it brought 14,000 pounds. Then underneath, you can see how older ships that had been built in Maine were being sold off. Everything was being sold off on the market, and in fact, the Longwood was never even registered in the United States. They had arranged a French registration to get it across the Atlantic, and then it was to be sold once it got to England, and that was it. The ship ultimately, so there wasn't that much interest locally in the ship because we had no ties, no connections to it, because it was sold to English merchants very early on. And that meant that getting much information on it back in the States was going to be very limited. It became more and more, the history of that particular ship gets more tragic as things go on. In 1870, it had been sold again in 1870 to Bristol merchants out of Liverpool and London now to Bristol, and it was purchased for the purpose of replacing a ship that had just been wrecked. The ship that had been wrecked in 1870 was the Avonmore, and it was being bought by the same merchants who had owned the Avonmore to replace her, and therefore we would call the ship the Longwood, they called her the Avonmore, and that's why I keep using the slash. The Avon, Moore, or Longwood had the unfortunate experience of being sent to pick up guano, okay, so bird dew. And it was very lucrative trade back then because it was the primary source of nitrate and the primary source of fertilizer in countries, especially as they're trying to increase productivity, per acre of land. And so the Longwood was one of 27 ships at anchor in the port of Juaníos when, in the evening of May 9, 1877, an earthquake hit Iquique, and right to the south of Callao. And there's a whole line of these guano ports all along the coast, and they're not really ports. They don't have port facilities. There would be smaller vessels that would bring the guano out to ships at anchor in the water. And so there are 27 of these ships in Juaníos. When the earthquake hit Iquique, it's centered in Iquique, and in the aftermath of the earthquake, a tidal wave hits or a tsunami hits. And this is presumably an artist's rendition in the London Illustrated News of what the remains of the Avon Moor, or for us, the Longwood, looked like. I can't make much out of it, but anyway. And of course, these illustrations in a lot of these publications had no basis in reality. It's like, oh, what would it look like? If a ship were destroyed, and let's go for it. And that's apparently what they did. The question here and the problem was that a company, or an archaeological company, a firm, the Institute of Nautical and Underwater Archaeology, was mounting a project in Juaníos. They're trying to identify the various ships. Now, actually, only 4 ships went down out of the 27. But let me, I'm sure I'm taking up more time than I should. Let's see. Oh, not too bad, but I'll get through this pretty fast. But I wanted to read you a description. Of all things, one of my favorite places to visit, in addition to the Custom House, is to go up to Searsport and the Penobscot Marine Museum. And instrumental in the formation of the museum up there in their collection were the Colcords. And Lincoln Colcord wrote fiction based on his maritime experiences. He was born on ship, going around the Horn. And the ship was going down when he was born. So he had a lot of stories, and his sister was also raised on board ships. And they were behind the founding also of American Neptune. They were very highly involved in that. So Lincoln, the son, Lincoln Colcord, in 1940 published an article reprinting the experiences of another Searsport, Maine captain who was in Juaníos when the tidal wave hit. And it's a wonderful description, and he survived. His ship survived, badly damaged, but had survived. At first, we experienced a trembling, which increased 1/2 minute or more. It kept growing stronger, lulling at times. It shook the ship like a leaf, and you could hardly stand on the deck. The shock lasted in full strength perhaps 2 or 3 minutes, then it passed away. Then came a most terrifying noise from the shore, rocks rolling from the mountains into the water, making a deafening roar, which in the intense darkness was appalling, because by now it was around 10 o'clock at night. Then the tidal wave came in like a boiling cauldron. It's a wonderful description. Here's a ship's captain writing back home to his brother, also a ship's captain, back in Searsport, and I love the imagery. Then the tidal wave came in like a boiling cauldron, ships taking anchors and chains with them, as though they were feathers. And in the rush, vessels shot round and round, collided with each other, going at the rate of 8 to 10 miles per hour. All we could do with the ship was to steer her. All around us, we could hear crashing vessels, one vessel crossing our bow, carried away, the jib boom and fittings attached. So, it's a long article and much more from the letters, but it gives you the idea of the horror in the middle of the night. And then when they woke up the next morning, or well, I'm not sure they ever went to bed at that point, because you had to start, if you wanted your ship that could still sail to move, you had to untangle all the anchors and chains, because everything had been pulled up and then swirled around, and nobody could get their anchor, nobody could get their chains, and you didn't have the underwater diving equipment you would have now to start doing something to sort it all out. And the human destruction was also something that was horrifying for people because of the death toll, and many of the captains down there had their families with them. And the Captain Nichols, who was writing to his brother back in Searsport, had helped to save one of the captains that he knew, one of the English captains, the captain of the Avonmore or the Longwood. And the captain had had his 4-year-old son strapped to him in order to try to save him from being, thrown. And the child survived with his father, but after the Captain Nichols from Searsport got to him, the little child died within an hour. His wife went. She had their 2-year-old daughter with her, and they had a nurse because the wife had also just given birth, and that 5-month-old child had been strapped to the nurse in order to try, to have her survive. All of them wiped out. It was just horrible. And then when I saw the child's name, they had named her for the ship. They had named her Avonmore. And it's like, note to self, never name a child for the ship that she's been born on. But anyway, the problem was this underwater archaeological project wanted to try to identify. And the person in charge, Christoph, rather naively, he sent me an example of what he was looking for. The British had these detailed insurance forms that they filled out with every detail of their ships that were registered, and he thought we might have had something like that in the United States. Yeah, we were just starting to license captains. So, there wasn't much like that, and every dimension of the keel in England would have been recorded, the exact type of wood, and he was looking. And of course, that's the point. They're trying to sort out what's what, which ship is which. And it's not just that they had the remains. There are only 4 of the 27 ships that actually sunk, and that would be at the bottom where they're exploring. The problem was all the bowsprits, all the other components of the ships that were damaged, all their rigging, the spars, the masts, everything is at the bottom of the water, and they're trying to sort it out. The best I could do was all as a result of my work on the Montana, because the Longwood was part of a series of ships that were all produced by Currier, and they were all using the same ship model, the same half-hull model in their design. And he worked with that model that his cousin William had produced from 1860 until the early 1870s, and the Montana was one of them. And I won't go into all the detail because it's mind-numbing. But there was an article in the Newburyport paper in 1865 that was my lead. In 1865, they talk about William J. Currier working for John Currier Jr., and that he was now building, in 1865, the 12th ship from the same model. And that was the Tennyson. And that's the precursor to the Montana. And then I could count back from the 12th. And I could, because Currier named he numbered all his ships. And what I had learned from the work I had done on Montana was that he also kept pretty good records, but only for the ships he intended to maintain control of, ships that he kept an interest in. Ships that he was just selling outright, he didn't have very good records about the construction. or didn't, maybe he had and then got rid of them. So I was working first of all from this concept that at least we didn't have anything. The longwood was here, you know, and 3 months after it was built, it was gone. And so no American ever painted a portrait of it. There were no photographs of it. And so I was using this theory about all these similar ships to say, at least I can send you pictures of these other ships that were all built from the same model. They might not have the same details to them on the deck in terms of the cabins and that kind of thing, but it's a pretty good bet. And so I used the Montana, and we had good pictures of the Montana. Michael Moroz had produced a whole series of details on the painting of the Montana, as well as the importer, and he allowed me to use them. And so I sent some of those details on to the people down in Chile. And then the Whittier was also from the same model. That's the photograph in the upper right, and then the Tennyson in the lower right. It wasn't much, but it gave them the sense of at least the basics. The real, the funny, well, I think it's funny, but maybe I'm getting a little daffy from looking at ship construction books. The other thing I was able to do for him was using Courier's records, and I finally found it. I could find ship, I think this was ship 71, and I could find the entries for when he bought wood and what kind of wood and the dimensions of the wood, and that's what I used in this. But it's so funny, when I put the report together for them, I said, oh, wood used. Okay, wood used. The timbers, the framing, oak. The sheathing, oak. You know, it's oak, oak, oak. It just goes on. You're just doing oak. And I did find that it was white oak, but I mean, in England they kept these records that were so precise about everything. I couldn't do that because I had the dimensions of the rough timbers that went to the shipyard. That's not what they ended up in their final dimensions. I found out that, okay, like all the other ships that were built in New England, they had locust tree nails used. And this is about all I could do. And then hackmatack, or tamarack, was used for the knees of the ship, where that's the way that they hung the timbers for the decking. These angle, pieces of wood. And that's all I could offer him. And hackmatack was used all over New England. And one of the other ships that they're trying to work on and discern is from Maine. So it would have also had most probably the very same components. The other thing I tried to find out was the equipment. And I was able to find out, the kind of capstan that had been used. They had ordered a hatch cover from Revere Copper Works, so I was able to also give the dimensions of that in case they come up. But I would suppose things underwater, the dimensions have changed. Things haven't remained the same over 100 years ago, or 150 years at this point, since the tidal wave. But anyway, that's our trip into the library. I did a couple things. I'm not sure if it's of any interest to people, or useful to people, I shouldn't say, of interest. But I did put together a list of some of the basic, sources on Newburyport history, especially dealing with maritime history. All the free places you can go online to get a look at these books. And to encourage you, if you have specific interest or research topics, you also have the most marvelous, the single best resource is, locally, the library and the archival collection. And you can do a lot from home, but you can't look at the books, right, from home. That's why I thought if some of the basic histories, Courier's histories, Cushing's history of Newburyport, Evale Smith's history, they're all right there online, and those types of things. The other thing is not to, avoid other places. When I was doing the Montana, I got some of the best material, at least on Tudor Ice Company, because they were carrying ice when they went down. And the Tudor Ice Company's records are all at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School. You know, there were wonderful things, and right now the move of the Peabody Essex Museum's collections, the library, the Phillips Library, to Rowley, 15 minutes away from here, it's like Wonderland, because the Courier records are there of the shipbuilding, the city records, Newburyport's records, going back to the 1600s. Some of the records are there. They were deposited in the 1920s. All the Custom House records, the real Custom House records, are at the Peabody Essex. They cover 105 linear feet of shelving. It's amazing. I've worked with the ship registers and things like that, and there's micro information about, you know, what came into the Custom House, what went out of the Custom House, how much tax they paid on everything. So there are wonderful resources all around here, and I think I blathered on too much, but anybody have any questions? No? Yeah?
Carrie, I don't have a question, but I have extra copies of the Cheney Collection book that I put on the end of the table. If anyone's
Oh, the pamphlet? Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good idea. All right. Well, I'm gonna. Oh, I'm sorry.
Accomattack is what type of tree?
Tamarack.
A tamarack.
Yeah, have you ever seen them?
Maine, you say?
No, all around. You know, at Maudsley State Park,
Yeah.
there are a couple tamarack.
Really?
Right in front of where Helen's house was.
Got it.
Okay, and they have needles, but their needles fall, and they were used for masts, and they have their branches and their roots go at right angles,
Yes.
and that's why they were used for knees, because of that. Yeah.
They would make dories with that as well. As
Did
I
they?
understand.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. And I knew I had a neighbor once that made his mast, you know, from one. And I thought that was funny in this day and age, doing that, but good for him, yeah.
Where is your research taking you now? Where are you going?
I'm doing more on, I would love to talk a model builder in building one of these ships, building a model of one of these ships. But I just keep doing work on the Montana, on the other ships. I've been putting together a database of black sailors in Newburyport. You know, there's just tons to keep me busy over there. And another great place, even though it's so far away, Mystic, Connecticut, Mystic Seaport's library has a lot on Newburyport. Has a lot on Newburyport ships. I mean, the libraries, maritime libraries, because of the influence of shipbuilding in Newburyport and the captains, because they all knew one another. They all socialized together, and the families, you know, all knew one another. And so there are photographs, there are all sorts of resources around, and it's not just in Newburyport. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, yeah.
Is that a hard topic to investigate or pursue black sailors because of...
No, you have crew lists, and they're in Rowley. The crew lists for Newburyport are sitting there, and there's a physical description in the crew list, and so you can pick out black sailors. Anyway, all right, thank you.